Imagine waking up every day inside a body you've never truly entered. You move, you speak, you act. But something inside feels borrowed, like you're impersonating a version of yourself you never chose. You play the role well, but the lines don't feel written by you. You feel watched, even when you're alone. And somewhere beneath the silence, something wants out. You've done everything they said would make you real. You learned to behave, to plan, to produce, to please. You became what was needed. But the more you succeeded, the more it slipped. That flicker of something raw, wild, and unmistakably yours. It's not just that you don't know who you are, it's that you've never been invited to meet yourself. And no one tells you the cost of that absence. What if your whole life has been a rehearsal? Not for something greater, but for someone else's idea of you. What if the face in the mirror is more mask than truth, more performance than presence? And what if every year you feel heavier, not from aging, but from dragging around a self that was never yours to begin with? You wonder why joy feels thin, why rest never satisfies, why loneliness clings even in company. Kierkegaard warned of this quietly fatal drift, a life spent outside the self, where one becomes a stranger to their own soul, not in dramatic failure, but in quiet imitation, not through evil, but through forgetfulness. The greatest tragedy, he said, is not to die, but to live without ever being truly born. And most will never notice it happening. The crack begins as a whisper, the suspicion that something is missing, but you can't name what. You feel it when you're alone, when the noise fades, when there's nothing left to impress. And in that silence, the question returns: what would be left of you if you stopped performing? You were not born as a concept, you were born as a presence. But before you could speak, you were already being shaped into something legible, useful, acceptable. Parents project, schools standardize, society selects, and so you begin to split, not visibly, but subtly, into the self that is, and the self that must be. Jung called this the great psychic lie, the belief that persona, the social mask, is the self. But a mask, no matter how refined, cannot feel. It only reacts. The more you confuse adaptation with identity, the more you exile the soul. Not intentionally, but as a survival reflex, because being real often means being rejected. So you make the trade, authenticity for belonging. Philosophers have traced this fracture for centuries. Nietzsche saw it as a denial of will, a quiet self-betrayal disguised as morality. Sartre called it mauvaise foi, bad faith, living inauthentically by pretending you are what you are not, out of fear of what you are. And Kierkegaard saw it as despair, the sickness of a self that does not will to be itself. But this is not just theory, it's emotional architecture. The ego builds its house from fear. Fear of rejection, failure, insignificance, exposure. And so it builds higher walls, more polished stories, tighter routines. But what it locks out is not danger, it's truth. Because the real self does not bloom inside safety. It emerges in risk, contradiction, and encounter. Trauma sharpens this division. The child who is shamed for crying becomes the adult who flinches at intimacy. The one who had to earn love becomes the achiever who never feels enough. Over time, these strategies calcify into identity, and the real self becomes myth, a buried relic. You call it growth, but it's often just more sophisticated avoidance. The culture deepens the trance. It rewards masks, sells certainty. It glorifies noise. It tells you to build a brand, not a self. To chase goals, not questions. To appear wise, not be whole. So you drift, slowly but efficiently, into a version of life where everything fits, except you. And the most dangerous part, you get good at it. You learn to function, to please, to win. You polish the glass until it gleams, but never ask what it's hiding. You avoid mirrors that aren't flattering. You shrink from silence that isn't filled. And in the absence of real inner contact, you confuse motion for meaning. You begin to notice it in small ways. You laugh, but it feels hollow. You succeed, but it doesn't land. You rest, but your mind won't stop gnawing. Every joy feels distant, like watching life through glass. You know how to function, but not how to feel. You know how to please others, but not how to speak to yourself. Your choices start to repeat. Same relationships, different names. Same patterns of avoidance, masked as logic. You overthink, overcommit, overcompensate, always trying to outrun a question that follows you like a shadow. Why doesn't any of this feel real? You cling to routine like a raft in an ocean you refuse to name. It's not depression, it's disconnection. You've been living in a copy of your life, close enough to feel familiar, but too distant to feel alive. You perform the identity you built, hoping that one day the performance will finally become the truth. But truth isn't something you create through imitation. It's something you uncover by subtraction. This is how people quietly disappear. Not with violence, but with exhaustion. They grow numb, they settle. They shrink into predictability. And the soul, having been ignored for so long, stops knocking. You no longer feel called to anything, just obligated. You become more tool than human, more manager than mystic. And you tell yourself, this is maturity. Even love becomes another transaction. You don't offer presence. You offer strategy. You seek not intimacy, but validation. You fear being seen for real because you no longer know what's under the costume. Vulnerability feels dangerous because the self underneath hasn't been touched in years. You fear being found out, but what you fear most is being found. Eventually, you mistake this numbness for your personality. This is just how I am, you say. But it's not how you are. It's how you've adapted. The cost of survival was authenticity. The cost of acceptance was wholeness. You didn't choose this trade consciously, but now you live inside its consequences. You're not unhappy because your life is hard. You're unhappy because your life is false. And no matter how much you polish the lie, it never feels like home. You may not know what the real you looks like, but you can feel the ache of its absence. You don't find your real self by building more. You find it by dissolving what was never truly you, not through force, but through radical honesty, through stillness, through letting the noise die so the signal can emerge. The self doesn't scream, it waits. Beneath the image, beneath the roles, beneath the urgency, something ancient is watching. Start small, begin where it hurts. Notice when your yes is a lie. Notice the tension in your chest before you speak. Feel the moment you abandon yourself to keep the peace. These aren't just habits, they're breadcrumbs. They lead back to the room where the real you still waits, untouched by all your strategies. Philosophy has always pointed toward this turning. The Delphic commandment, know thyself. The Taoist unlearning, the Zen clarity. Before enlightenment, chop wood. After enlightenment, chop wood. These are not metaphors for perfection. They are calls to remember. Remember what you were before the world told you what to be. Reclaiming yourself is not about rebellion. It's not loud. It's not aesthetic. It's the quiet courage to stop pretending, to stop negotiating with fear, to ask, without flinching, what is mine, what is borrowed? What must be let go, no matter how long I've carried it? This is not a brand. This is a shedding. You stop being defined by what you avoid. You stop choosing based on what keeps you comfortable. You feel again, fully, painfully, truthfully. And in the chaos of that feeling, you begin to re-inhabit your life. Not the version people recognize, but the one you were born to live before you were taught to edit. This is where your power returns, not by adding new layers, but by stripping down to what cannot be taken from you. The original you, the unrepeatable spark, the presence behind the persona. It was never gone. Just buried beneath years of pleasing, performing, perfecting. And once you remember, the world looks different. You don't need to know where it's going. You don't need to define it. You only need to feel it. The faint pull of something real, and the willingness to follow it even if no one else sees it. Especially then. Because that's when you're closest to meeting yourself. You were never meant to live as a stranger to yourself. You were never meant to trade your soul for approval, your voice for comfort, your life for imitation. The real tragedy is not that people fail. It's that they succeed in becoming exactly what they were told to be, and lose the thread of who they truly are. There is a moment, quiet, unmistakable, when you realize no one is coming to give you back to yourself. Not a parent, not a lover, not a title. You will have to turn inward. You will have to feel what you've avoided, name what you've denied, and reclaim what you abandoned. And you'll have to do it alone. But this is not loneliness. It is liberation. Because when you stop outsourcing your being to others, you begin to taste something deeper than comfort. You begin to feel presence, integrity, the peace that comes not from being liked, but from being whole, not from being seen, but from seeing. Most people will never arrive at this, not because they can't, but because they don't dare to question the mirror. They confuse reflection with truth. They polish the image, never asking what it hides. They drift, smile, achieve, retire, and one day vanish, having never truly been. But you feel the fracture. You sense the lie. You ache, not because something is wrong, but because something real is waking up. Stay with that ache. It is not weakness. It is the signal that you are close to something raw, terrifying, and real. The self behind the script. To meet yourself is not an event. It is a lifelong unfolding, a gentle, relentless peeling away of what isn't yours. It asks everything and offers only one reward. You, not the idea of you, not the resume, not the mask, just you. Unguarded, unnamed, undeniable. And once you've tasted that self, even for a moment, the performance ends. The war within goes quiet. And you realize you were never lost. You were only buried. And now, finally, you are returning home.